Today, we're going to demystify the world of business forecasting. We're going to do it by climbing something I call the ladder of forecasting. We'll start at the very bottom with the simplest methods you can imagine and work our way all the way up to the really powerful stuff the big companies are using. So, let's get climbing.
I mean, it's the million-dollar question, right? How does any company, whether you're forecasting sales or expenses or how many customer calls you're going to get, how do you actually do it? It might seem like some kind of dark art, but you know what? There's a really clear, logical way to think about it.
Before you get to any fancy algorithm, any complex spreadsheet, every single forecast has to start with reality. And that reality is your actual historical results. This is the bedrock. It is the absolute ground truth that every single prediction has to be built on. Without this, you're not forecasting, you're just guessing.
Okay, so step one on our journey is right here with the baseline of truth, the actuals. This is the foundation, and everything else we talk about is built on top of this.
All right, now we can take our first real step up that ladder. And you might be surprised to hear that this first rung, it's not about being complicated. It's about setting up a super simple but really powerful benchmark that every other fancy method has to prove it can beat. So meet the naïve forecast. This is probably the simplest forecasting method on the planet. All you do is you take today's number and you say, yep, that's what tomorrow's number is going to be. And I know what you're thinking. That sounds almost, well, too simple, doesn't it? But for a really stable business or for super short-term predictions, it's shockingly effective.
And the real power of this naïve method is in its simplicity. First off, it's totally transparent. Everyone gets it immediately. It's super fast to calculate. But the most important thing? It gives you a rock-solid benchmark that you have to beat.
And this right here, this is the critical point. This quote is like the ultimate reality check for forecasting. If you spend weeks building some super sophisticated model and it can't even do better than just using yesterday's number, you've basically wasted your time. This is the very first hurdle any forecast has to clear.
Okay, but what if your business isn't perfectly stable day to day? What if you have a lot of volatility, a lot of noise in your data? Well, the next step up the ladder is to start using averages to kind of smooth out all those bumps and see what's really going on underneath. So we've got two main flavors here. On one hand, you have the simple moving average, which just takes the plain old average of the last few periods, say the last 3 months. But what if what happened last month is way more important than what happened 3 months ago? Well, that's where the weighted moving average comes in. It lets you give more importance or more weight to the most recent data.
You know, this method is just so intuitive. You're basically saying, hey, last month's performance tells me the most about what's coming next, so I'll give it 60% of the vote. The month before that, still pretty relevant, but less so. Let's give it 30%. And the one before that gets the last 10%. See? It's a really simple but incredibly powerful way to capture momentum.
So far, we figured out how to handle random noise. But what happens when the patterns in your data aren't random at all? You know, like a retail business that always spikes in December or a call center that's always busiest on Mondays. A simple average just isn't going to cut it. For this kind of problem, we need to pull out a different tool. Exponential smoothing. It's really a whole family of methods that are specifically designed to handle data that has these clear trends and predictable cycles. You can think of it as a much, much smarter way of doing averages. And just like with averages, there are different levels here. The simple version of exponential smoothing is a lot like a weighted moving average. But then you can level up to Holt's method, which adds a special component to account for a trend. And then you can level up again to the Holt-Winters method, which adds yet another piece to handle seasonality. It really strikes this great balance between being simple enough to use, but accurate enough to be useful.
Okay, so far, every method we've looked at has been based purely on time. We've only been looking at past results to predict future ones. But to get to a truly mature forecast, you have to take a huge leap forward. You have to start asking why things are happening.
This is where we start to connect our forecast to the real-world operations of the business. So instead of just looking at the final revenue number, we're going to look at the inputs that actually drive that revenue. And we call these your business drivers. Just look at these examples. Revenue isn't just some magic number that appears, right? It's the result of how many units you sell times the price you sell them at and the mix of products. Your operating expenses are driven by how many people you have on staff and what their average salary is. When you start forecasting the drivers, you build a model that's way more realistic and, honestly, way more useful.
Now, the main tool we use to build these driver-based models is called regression.
It's a statistical technique that basically creates a mathematical formula for the relationship between your inputs, like your marketing spend or sales headcount, and your output, like revenue. The key thing to remember here is that this relationship isn't set in stone. You have to keep refreshing the model with new data to make sure it stays accurate.
I absolutely love this analogy because it just nails it. Think about it. Your annual budget is usually this static thing you create once a year based on a bunch of assumptions. A regression-based forecast, though, it's alive. It's constantly learning from your actual results and adjusting its own assumptions month after month. It's dynamic.
And that brings us to the very top of our ladder, machine learning. This is where things get incredibly powerful. I mean, ML models can look at hundreds of drivers at the same time and find these super complex patterns that a human would never, ever see. But all that power comes with a really important trade-off. While they can be insanely accurate, they are often black boxes. That means it can be nearly impossible to explain why the model gave you a certain number. And trust me, when your boss asks you to justify the forecast, the algorithm said so is not a great answer.
So, we've climbed the entire ladder, from that simple, naive forecast all the way up to complex machine learning. Now for the most important question of all, how in the world do you choose the right method for you?
Okay, this slide is basically the cheat sheet for our entire journey. It's the practical takeaway. If your business is pretty stable, hey, start simple with a naive or moving average forecast. If you've got obvious trends and seasons in your data, then exponential smoothing is your friend. If you have really clear business drivers that you can measure, then it's time to use regression. And only if you have absolutely massive, complex data sets and you need to update things constantly should you even think about venturing into machine learning.
And this brings us to what I think is the central theme of this whole explainer. It is so tempting to always reach for the fanciest, most sophisticated tool on the ladder. But that is a trap. More complexity just adds more assumptions, more things that can break, and it requires specialized skills. It is only worth it if it gives you a real, meaningful improvement over a simpler method.
Just let that one sink in for a second. Simple models are transparent, they're easy for everyone to understand and to explain, they're quick to update, and you know what? A lot of the time, that is way more valuable than a tiny little bump in accuracy from some complex model that nobody understands or knows how to maintain.
So I'm going to leave you with this final question. The ultimate goal of forecasting isn't to get the number perfectly right. That's impossible. The real goal is to create a tool that helps your whole organization make smarter decisions. So ask yourself, does our forecast help us act faster? Does it help us think with more clarity? Because that is the real test of a truly great forecast.